Now it's time for Matti Tahvonen. Is it the way you
Tahvonen, yes.
Tahvonen, yeah. He will talk about being productive developer using JPA helper libraries, and give him a big hand.
I'm just taking a picture that I want to show my boss how many people were here. Thank you for showing up here. I'm going to talk today about JPA and about a couple of libraries that I have become quite a big fan about. And before we actually get to the business, I could actually make a kind of a confession. I'm not really a backend developer, and I'm still here talking about JPA today. I'm a UI developer. I have been working with our main open source product called Vaadin framework. How many of you know what it is? Okay, about half. So it's really not working at the JPA level at all, but my job is pretty awesome at the moment. I'm like a developer advocate for Vaadin framework, and I'm building lots of kind of integration examples, how Vaadin can be used with different kind of technologies. And there, when I'm actually making these examples, there I'm using quite a lot of JPA because I think most of the Java developers, they actually use JPA at least some project. So the kind of the integration between Vaadin and the JPA layer needs to be quite nice. And actually, it was there when I kind of became big fanatic about these libraries because I didn't want the whole integration example or the example application. I didn't want to like most of that part to be some JPA specific stuff or lots of boilerplate with like JPQL queries or criteria APIs and stuff like that. So these libraries really like simplify the whole application as well, or my example applications. And one thing to note also that I have like pretty much no relation to these projects that I work with. What I'm talking about, I know the developers who are working behind these projects, but they are not giving me any money, so you can. I'm not here to sell you this product. I'm just kind of bringing up the knowledge about, for example, DeltaSpike Data. How many of you know DeltaSpike Data? Pretty much nobody. Okay. Yeah, one person, and it's like really awesome library. If you work with JPA in a Java EE environment, I think pretty much everybody should use DeltaSpike Data at the moment. If you are not using some kind of Spring tag, and then you are Spring stack, and then you will be using Spring Data JPA library. Okay, so in the first part of the presentation, I will talk about JPA and about actually like sticking to standards or using some enhancement libraries above those standards. And then I will talk a bit more detailed about DeltaSpike Data and how it works and how you should actually use that in a Java EE environment. And then I will do the same thing about CureDiesel. And actually, if we go back to the DeltaSpike Data, it's kind of a replica in CDI from Spring Data, which is pretty much the same thing for the Spring users. So I think everything that you learn here in the DeltaSpike Data section, you can pretty much adapt that to the Spring world if you have a Spring-based stack in your Java application. And then in the end, I will discuss a bit of which of these libraries should you really use. So how many of you like JPA? How many of you hate JPA? I hate it at least sometimes. Yeah, and you must have at least faced some of your colleagues who really don't like to use JPA. They are always saying that we shouldn't use JPA in this application at all, and it's just broken stuff that we shouldn't use it, and we should make all the queries like manually with SQL. And I think that's mostly because of wrong expectations, and they are thinking that it's kind of a silver bullet that if you use some kind of object relational mapping tool. It's not. It's always some kind of a leaky abstraction, and you need to know when you work with JPA, even if you are using some helper libraries that I'm using here, you always need to know that there is this database behind the machines. And the part that I really like in JPA at the moment is this mapping part. It's quite good already nowadays, especially in 2.1. You can use pretty much like normal business applications. You can stick to the standard API and do the mapping part, and it's quite rare that you need to go to some Hibernate-specific mapping things at all. But the query part, that's something that I'm not that big fanatic about, and actually all these libraries only work with the queries, so they don't like change anything in the actual JPA entities and in the mapping. JPQL query, I think it's the nicest way to use JPA if you are using raw entity manager and only the standard API. But JPQL, it's still a query language. It's very easy to actually make tuples when you write these queries. If I need to write some query in JPQL, it's quite very rare that I kind of get it right on the first try. So there is always some tuple, and some tooling can help there a bit, but it's still a query language. I like object-oriented programming quite a lot, and criteria API is of course kind of a bit small enhancement to this JPQL query, but actually I think it makes your code quite complex. So if you look at some criteria API queries that you have built, it's almost impossible to kind of interpret those. You will need to spend quite a lot of time refactoring your criteria query builders so that you can actually maintain it and modify it in the future. And one thing I actually missed from my very early days of Java development when I was working with real projects, then we were using raw Hibernate's first versions, and there was this query by example feature, which is really nice. That was kind of an object-oriented way to do queries, and in JPA there is no such a thing. And well, as a summary, I think if you make some kind of simple DAOs for your application, it's typically quite error-prone, and you will be repeating yourself quite a lot. You will be writing the similar JPQL queries for different entities, and that's why actually I didn't want to use JPA at all at some point in my Vaadin examples, because all the code was then looking quite weird because there was so much this JPA stuff there. But I don't blame JPA or the standard actually at all. Standards are always kind of problematic because, for example, in JPA there were 2-3 implementations that they tried to bake into one standard, and they were quite far from each other in the beginning, and it's very hard to actually agree that we are doing these and these and these. And standards are good, but they move slowly, and they have to make some kind of compromises there. So the question is that, do you want to be a Java EE purist? Do you want to only use the raw APIs, or do you want to in JPA, or do you want to use, for example, I don't like JSF, I can say that aloud. I like actually Wicked, which is probably the closest competitor to Vaadin. I think they are much better solutions than anything from the actual Java EE specification for making web UIs. And there are lots of libraries that will make your life better in Java. Especially, for example, Apas Commons, I'm using those libraries quite a lot, and they just make some things better in the core Java, in Java SE better, not just improving the Java EE specification. And how I actually came to these JPA helper libraries was one webinar that we were building with Josh Long from Pivotal, and we wanted to make some kind of a Vaadin UI for Spring Stack, and I was quite impressed in the process how kind of Josh Long created. He actually, when he's doing sessions, he's copy-pasting everything from a second screen. But when we were planning this session, he actually created this full CRUD backend, for example, with read, write, find all, and stuff like that. He created that in a kind of a minutes, and there was no entity manager at all involved, but there was this JPA entity, and then he added some special methods as well. So in this case, you will get the, sorry about the green color, it doesn't, I'm not sure if you can see it, but in the interface person repository that extends JPA repository, there will be lots of handy methods like save, delete, find all, and stuff like that automatically. And then you can actually write these methods to interface only. And what happens when the Spring context starts is that it finds these repository interfaces and it automatically implements the actual implementations for these classes. And it can also implement this custom method there only by checking out this method name here. So it finds by last name, and it has one parameter, and the return type is list. So from these details, it can figure out automatically that it needs to make a query like select person where last name equals last name, and that's it. Nothing else needed to done, and you will get the result right away to your. You can inject this class into your other Spring beans, like for example with Vaadin, you can make Vaadin UI components Spring managed beans, so you can directly inject this repository into a Vaadin UI and then just use these methods there in your UI code, and you will be up with your CRUD application like in a couple of minutes. Then, because I need to be fanatic for both Spring backend and Java EE backend, and I think they are both actually I think they are very good basis for your applications. I wanted to kind of clean up also my examples that I have been made for Java EE platform. So they were looking quite crappy after I had been doing these changes for Spring examples because they started to really clean. And I started to search for different kind of libraries that could maybe help it in a Java EE environment. And the initial choice was actually to use Spring Data, because you can use Spring Data as well in Java EE environment, but that of course requires, there's like a CDI integration so that you can make these also CDI beans. But it requires that there's like a full Spring stack injected into your Java EE server as well, and that will add something like 40 megabytes of extra to your WAR file. So that's not like an optimal solution, but DeltaSpike Data, it's pretty much like a clone, or it has gotten its inspiration from Spring Data. So I started to play with that, and nowadays I'm practically using or basing all of my Java EE examples so that there is like DeltaSpike Data repositories behind the scene. So repository principles, or repository pattern. There you will be building this kind of one repository per each entity. And it can be interface or it can be abstract class. You can make some implementation there manually also if you want. And the idea is that the container generates most of the methods for you. And if there are simple additions, it can use this method naming convention. And if there are some complex cases, there will be some complex cases, then you can pretty easily go all the way back to the JPQL and define this JPQL for only this one complex method. And you can just like give an annotation, for example, into that kind of interface that there was for Spring Data here. You could add a query annotation there and explicitly define the query there. And typically, you will not need to access the entity manager directly at all. Of course, it's used there behind the scenes. And this is pretty much, it's not the same repository. I think the previous one had customer and this one has a user, but it's pretty similar in nature. So this is in DeltaSpike Data. It's a bit different. You have like an annotation there, which is marking all the repositories. This for entity parameter is actually obsolete because we are defining it there as a type parameter as well. So for these repositories, you will need to define the actual entity type and the primary key type, which is long in this case. So how would you actually use DeltaSpike Data? DeltaSpike Data is like a plain CDI library. You don't need to actually have a full-featured Java EE server at all. If you want to go with just plain Tomcat, you can throw in Weld there and use DeltaSpike Data there, but I think I'm not going to suggest that to anyone, because the modern Java EE servers, they are like really lightweight, so you really shouldn't avoid those. And I have had an honor to work with Arun Gupta, for example, and David Blevins, and those Java EE experts. They always like have this mechanism to use JPA in Java EE. Have an AGP which will kind of proxy all your or hide your all JPA code, and then because lightweight AGPs nowadays, they make very easy for you to use JTA transactions. You will get the transaction handling practically for free, and then also always use the container provided persistency context. And this is how I actually adapted my way of using DeltaSpike Data to Java EE setup. So practically I'm using this stateless AGP there, still the same. It can also inject the entity manager if you want to do some low-level code there as well. But the AGP is kind of doing all the transaction management, it's doing all the pooling if you have like lots of usage. And you can also, because you have this AGP in front of your repositories, then you can also limit or modify somehow the API that is seen by your UI code. Or then you can, for example, change some naming. So if you have been using, for example, delete name in your data access objects before, and repository pattern is using remove name there, then you can just change the name there in the AGP level. And maybe the largest helper there is that you can access multiple repositories in the same transaction, so you can inject multiple repositories to the same AGP and use those in one method, and all the changes that you make to those are executed in one single transaction. I have a terrible flu, so I actually did the same presentation in Java 1, and I kind of live coded this kind of application, or not the full application. There was let me zoom in a bit. This is I thought it was kind of cool idea to have a library example if you have JPA libraries. So it's a simple crude example with two tables, categories and books, and you can, okay, is it running? Yes. You can filter it, you can search for Java books, and then you can edit those or delete those, and all the basic features that you have in your business applications. And then I had a fake backend, and I switched that to DeltaSpike Data repository-based backend. But I think this time we will just check out how I did it then. So the first step when you actually start using DeltaSpike Data is naturally to configure the dependencies. How many of you actually know DeltaSpike in general? Really? Okay, so not just DeltaSpike Data. So DeltaSpike is like a CDI extension library, and there's lots of different kind of modules, not just related to JPA development, but it's really handy tool for any Java EE applications. I really like to use that in. I need to sneeze, sorry. Really nice helpers, for example, configuration properties and in the core module, and lots of different kind of helpers. So you need to add DeltaSpike core first as an example here, and then you need to add the actual DeltaSpike data model. So there are two dependencies, one for runtime and one for compile time. So nothing more from that. But the way how I wanted to kind of adapt this to kind of a good way to use in Java EE environment needs some additional configuration for DeltaSpike data, because by default it's using user-managed transactions. And this will naturally not work in an AGP-based setup and JDA-based setup. So I will practically use this kind of container-managed transaction strategy there. And what it actually does is that it doesn't do anything except to do the actual JPA and entity manager access related stuff there. So it's not doing any transactions at all. Then the next thing is to naturally create these repositories. So let's look at the category repository first, because it's very, very simple. In this one I have like no special setup here at all. So it's only extending the super interface and defining this category and long as a primary key. And then in the facade, which is AGB, so it's annotated with stateless, I'm injecting the category repository there. And let's take some very simple example. For example, the save. So I'm calling this from the UI code here. When actually user clicks the save button, which I showed you just a couple of moments ago, the execution goes here. It goes through the entity facade, and here in the entity facade, I'm practically just calling the repository method here. But actually here happens much more, because it's the stateless AGP. There is this transaction management automatically handled there. And in the UI code, I just need to catch the exception if there is maybe like if you have version annotations in your entities for optimistic locking, then it will kind of grab those exceptions here. And if we'll look at some more usage of this repository here, I think I prepared one like a query by example style of query here. Okay, here. So I was talking about this Hibernate query by example thing, and actually DeltaSpike Data has a pretty similar feature built in, and it's not even like it's not implementation dependent, so you can use it on Eclipse Link or you can use it on Hibernate. So practically what I'm doing here to search for a category with a string filter, I'm just creating a model entity here, and then set its name with the filter. This can be, for example, Java here at the moment, or well, whatever. I don't remember what values I had there. And then I will call this kind of method. There is actually one simpler method as well. There is find by, where you can pass the category. And in this case, it's not doing like queries, what I'm doing in this case, because quite many UIs nowadays have this kind of a built-in filtering where you can on the fly filter the stuff that you display on. So I think this is a pretty relevant example actually to do. So this automatically, this like version of this API is kind of adding these percentage marks to the string type fields, and then as a second parameter, or as a parameter array, we need to add the properties that we actually use in the filtering. So this category example could actually have like other values set as well, but here we are defining which ones are actually used in the query. And this is just a JPA meta model automatically generated from my entity. You could use a string there as well. Okay, and let's check out about the book repository as well. Here was these methods, like find by category, so by naming convention. So here it's making like select a book where category equals this category. And pretty much similar filtering that we did with the query by example thing. We can do that by a naming convention-based method as well. So here we are specifying that we are searching for a name and with a like query, and we will ignore the case as well. Pretty simple. So what we did there, we added the dependencies, then we, I actually forgot to discuss about this. So actually when you're using DeltaSpike data, you always need to kind of expose the entity manager as a CDI bin, because DeltaSpike is a poor CDI library. It doesn't depend to Java EE specification at all. It cannot use the persistency context annotation in its code. So that's why you actually have to create this kind of a producer which will expose it to your CDI code. So after this, actually, you can put into any arbitrary CDI bin also the entity manager with a simple inject annotation. Then we configured the transaction management, and then we did the repositories and modified the service class. The first thing that you will face if you take out my example application from the GitHub and start to develop something, that you will need to have some kind of paging there as well. If you have a large database, you just cannot find all the values from the database. So with DeltaSpike data, you can add like this kind of a limit parameters there and annotate those with first result and max results. And it will automatically add them to the actual JPQL query that it creates. And another way to do it is to use QueryDSL, which is kind of an intermediate result that you get from the repository. And for that intermediate result, you can actually set these same values. So you can set the first result, the max result, and you can also configure sorting there. And then you can just return the result list. So this is what I would pretty much write into my facade method if I would be using this in Vaadin code. That would make like a lazy loading of data there. I think we pretty much talked about this already, but what happens when you use this naming convention too much? This is actually from my one of my hobby projects that I've been working on. It became a bit too long, and you definitely want to write these long methods. I think it doesn't really make sense. So then you need to make some kind of other way to define the query. You can use a query annotation, but it pretty much has the same problem that query will be long there in the code, and it's not that convenient to kind of cut it there. You can use named query. It's actually a much better solution. Then it's not that long, and the query is somewhere else, not here in the repository. And then then you can like consider using this where was I? Here, query by example setup. So if you have like really dynamic queries, then I think query by example is the way to go here. And DeltaSpike data also has this kind of a criteria API helper. Kind of, it makes criteria queries a bit better, but I have actually never used this myself. With Spring Data, I have been using CureDiesel, and that's actually the thing that I'm suggesting to use if you want to have like a dynamically built queries. Then you should use CureDSL, and we'll talk about that next. So CureDiesel, it kind of creates you type-safe Java API to construct the queries, and this is really the way how I can build like a complex query so that it actually works on my first try, because I have a dyslexia and I will make those typos a lot. So I'm using this quite a lot for more complex stuff. So if you think of this repository pattern, and if you use only these naming conventions and default methods that you find there, if you would have this kind of interface, this is actually quite typical for many business applications, that you can have some kind of UI there, how you can make pretty much any kind of SQL query with this UI. And if you need to do this with repository pattern or JPQL queries, I think I would go mad there. So programmatic approach, even if it was like a criteria API or CureDiesel or the improvements in DeltaSpike data, it really is much better for complex queries and long queries, and especially this kind of dynamic queries. CureDiesel is not like criteria API. It's for dynamically building your query, but it's very different. It's more like Joku, but it's for JPA, and actually it's not for JPA either. You can actually use CureDiesel for plain Java collections as well, but I have never done that either. I'm using it with JPA only, and there we are starting with this kind of queue customer helper objects, and this is kind of a query helper for customer entity here. And because this API is kind of a fluent and unlike like criteria API, this way these actual codes they become like really readable, and they look quite a lot of like queries, like real queries that you write on SQL or JPQL, unlike those that you create with criteria API. So that's where I actually like this. You don't need to use this Fluent API. You can, for example, get these predicates there, customer first name equals Bob. You can build that predicate somewhere else in your helper method. For example, if you are making a dynamic search UI, then you can build those separately and just place them there with your Java code. So no need to use this Fluent API, but it really helps you to create more readable code. So this is some example from the original implementer of CureDiesel. So this is kind of, I don't even want to read that. That's like plain criteria API. And here it's implemented with CureDiesel. So it's much more compact, and it goes in the right direction, that you query something from, and then you add the predicates in a where clause, and you will actually understand it much better. So how does it actually work? I will not code this either, but you will need one dependency on the runtime, and but the real magic is actually here. So you need to configure the code generation for these queue prefix helpers, and it's working with annotation processor tool. So you could, in theory, configure this in your IDE somehow as well, so that each time when you actually make some changes to the entity, it happens automatically in your IDE, that it updates this query object. But I have been using this kind of Maven plugin that actually executes it once I have made some changes to the entities. I will execute once my Maven install, and it will automatically update all these query objects. And then I'm using it in a pretty much same fashion. So I'm using it in AGP. I'm injecting the persistency context directly there. And typically, in the facade, I will build this kind of a query root helper, because that's pretty much what you are doing for each query for books, if you're querying for book only. And actually, if you're using Spring Data, they have like a really nice integration directly built into Spring Data, that you will practically get this for free, this helper method that I have built here. So there you can just kind of pass in the predicates for the repository. And there, if you can see the actual code there, so we are querying from the book, making a join on category, and then filtering on category and fetch the result. So the question is then, which one should I use of these helper libraries? And I think it's pretty easy to choose Spring Data if you have a Spring stack. But if you are working with Java EE, then I would definitely go for DeltaSpike Data, even though it's really badly known. There was like one person in this room who actually knew DeltaSpike Data, and I think it should be really known much better. It's pretty much as good as Spring Data, so go for it if you have a Java EE-based backend. Definitely go with it. But I think QueryDSL is kind of a special in this case, so I think I would choose either Spring Data or DeltaSpike Data, but I would use QueryDSL when these repository libraries are not that appropriate anymore. So when we head into some problems or your queries became too kind of complicated for the repository pattern, then I would go for QueryDSL, and that would be kind of an extra layer to still stay out of the raw JPQL queries or SQL queries. So simple CRUD operations, for those I would use repository libraries and simple static queries. But when there would be need for more dynamic and complex queries, then I would go with QueryDSL. And always, when you're using these kind of helper libraries, you can always go all the way to the entity manager level and use the low-level Java EE API there. Okay, I think we are pretty much done with this presentation. In Java 1, I was in a hurry with this presentation because I did the live coding, but I guess I was faster just to show the actual code. The example application that I had there, it's available in GitHub in that location. So ms/JPA-library-example. I think the slides will be online, so you can probably click that link from the PDF as well. And in my GitHub repository, there are actually a couple of other example applications which are using heavily these libraries as well. Okay, I hope you have some questions as well.
Come on, some questions.
You probably know also Liferay Service Builder. How do you compare it?
I'm not sure if there are too many Liferay developers here, but I really don't like the service builder in Liferay. I have played around with it, but actually I've wrote an article about using Spring Data in Liferay just, I think, 2-3 months ago, because I was supposed to create lots of Liferay related content for Vaadin lately, and I really didn't want to use this service builder because it's not like a real JPA. You cannot use real relations there. It's like a bad quality databases that you are making with Liferay service builder. It's very fast because there is no like complex relational database problems behind the scenes, and it's pretty fast to get started as well, but I think it's even faster to get started with a modern Java EE stack and these kind of helper libraries. So I think it doesn't make sense to use Service Builder if you can do it with a standard or more closer like a standard setup as well.
No more questions? Okay, then I think we can give Matti a big hand, please, for question.
Thank you.
And then it's time for lunch, I think at 12 o'clock. Once stir up, as you know. Yep.